Imagine holding a single banknote worth $100 trillion and still not having enough to buy a loaf of bread. This actually happened in Zimbabwe in 2008. Picture a mother pushing a wheelbarrow through a dusty market, not to carry groceries home, but simply to haul enough cash to pay for them. How does a nation's money become worth less than the paper it's printed on? The answer begins decades earlier with a promise of freedom. In the 1970s, this land was called Rhodesia, and its rich red soil fed much of southern Africa, with tobacco, maize, and cattle filling every farm. Zimbabwe won independence in 1980, and for a while, hope ran high. Robert Mugabe promised unity, land reform, and a bright new future for all. For nearly 2 decades, the economy held steady, as commercial farms kept exporting grain, tobacco, and beef across the world, filling ships and railcars. But beneath the surface, resentment simmered. Millions of black Zimbabweans still worked land they didn't own, soil their ancestors had once tilled freely. In 2000, Mugabe's government launched a violent land reform, seizing thousands of white-owned farms and handing them to veterans and loyalists. Many new landholders had no training in commercial farming. Fields that once yielded record harvests fell silent and overgrown within a single season. Food production collapsed by more than half. A country that once exported crops now begged for emergency grain shipments to feed its people. Foreign investors fled, farm equity used to secure loans vanished, and banks stopped lending as factories quietly closed their gates for good. Tax revenue dried up, just as spending exploded, funding a costly war in the Congo and lavish payouts to veterans and party loyalists. With nothing left to tax and no one willing to lend, Zimbabwe's government turned to the only lever still within its reach. At the Reserve Bank, printing presses began running day and night, churning out new bills to cover a deficit that only kept widening. The central bank's governor defended it openly, calling the printing a matter of survival. Critics called it a slow-motion act of self-destruction. At first, the effect seemed almost invisible. Prices rose gently, the way they always had, and nobody sensed the storm gathering beneath the surface. But each new bill chasing the same scarce goods pushed prices higher, which pushed the government to print even more, faster than before. It became a vicious cycle feeding on itself, an inflation snowball rolling downhill, gathering size and speed with every single passing day. By 2003, annual inflation crossed 500%. Shoppers noticed prices climbing between the moment they entered a store and the moment they paid. By 2006, inflation topped 1,000%. Zimbabwe issued a revalued dollar, slicing 3 zeros off every note, a fresh start on paper only. It didn't work. Within months, the new currency was hemorrhaging value just as fast as the old one it had replaced. By 2007, inflation soared past 66,000%. Supermarket workers repriced shelves several times a day, sometimes while customers still stood in the aisle. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily, then spent their wages within hours because by evening that same cash bought noticeably less. Restaurant menus stopped printing prices altogether. Waiters simply announced the day's cost aloud, sometimes revising the number before dessert had even arrived. By late 2008, Zimbabwe's inflation defied ordinary counting. Economists later estimated it near 80 billion%, a number almost too vast to picture. To keep pace, the central bank kept adding zeros to its banknotes, 10,000 becoming 100,000, then 1,000,000 within a single year. Then came 10 million, then 100 million, then 1 billion. Printers could barely design new bills fast enough to outrun the collapsing currency. In January 2009, the Reserve Bank released its most infamous creation, a single banknote worth 100 trillion Zimbabwean dollars. On paper, it looked like unimaginable wealth. In practice, that $100 trillion note could barely purchase 3 eggs at a local market stall. Within days, even that number wasn't enough. Prices doubled roughly every day, a pace economist compared to the worst crises in history. People carried bricks of banknotes just to buy bread, rubber bands snapping under the weight of stacks nobody bothered to count anymore. Bank queues stretched for blocks, not because people wanted cash, but because withdrawal limits forced them to return again and again each day. Street vendors weighed cash on scales instead of counting it, since tallying every worthless bill would have taken longer than the sale itself. Savings accounts, pensions, and life insurance policies all evaporated. A lifetime of careful saving could no longer buy a single bus ticket. Parents who had saved for years to send children to university watched those funds shrink to less than the price of a candy bar. Barter quietly crept back into daily life. Neighbors trading eggs for soap, chickens for fuel, favors for whatever scraps of value remained. Meanwhile, the U.S. dollar and South African rand began circulating unofficially, tucked under mattresses, trusted far more than any local note. Shopkeepers openly demanded foreign currency instead, even as authorities insisted, at least on paper, that only Zimbabwean dollars were legal tender. Even teachers and nurses stopped showing up to work, their monthly salaries, paid in local currency, no longer covering a single day's transport. By early 2009, the fiction could no longer hold. The government quietly abandoned its own currency, officially permitting foreign money instead. Overnight, the Zimbabwean dollar stopped circulating in daily life. Shops repriced everything in U.S. dollars, and the chaos almost instantly calmed. It was a stunning admission. The only way to save the economy was to stop using the very money the government itself had created. Years later, the central bank offered an exchange. Bring in your old trillion-dollar notes and receive a handful of real U.S. dollars. For most people, the exchange amounted to almost nothing, a final, quiet insult after years spent chasing a currency that kept vanishing. Today, that $100 trillion note isn't spent anywhere. It's sold online to collectors, a novelty souvenir of one of history's worst hyperinflations. Only Hungary's pengo, right after the Second World War, ever collapsed faster than Zimbabwe's dollar did, across that long, disorienting decade. Economists still study the collapse as the ultimate cautionary tale. What happens when a printing press replaces real, productive wealth? Because money was never really the paper or the zeros stamped across it. It was always just a shared, fragile promise. Zimbabwe found out, at staggering cost, exactly what happens the moment people stop believing that promise will hold until tomorrow. So next time you hold a banknote, remember what really gives it value. And if these stories of empires, money, and collapse pull you in, subscribe for the next one.